Hello, this is Kyle again, and this video is about using variables and assigning values with Python. Now, we'll be talking a lot more about what variables are in the first real video series. This is just getting started. This is just a way of getting you acquainted with Python and showing you some basic things. And we'll be continuing the example we started in the last video, and we'll be continuing it through the next video. This is a really good opportunity for you to put together your first Python program, and so let's just continue with that. But first, maybe we should loosely define what is a variable. A variable is something that exists in almost all programming languages, and it is something that stores a value in memory, and it can change during the run of the program. The variable is named, and that represents the location in memory where the value is stored. The name variable, you might be familiar from high school math classes, where we would say we have a variable named x, and that's kind of the same concept. We have this thing, we can call it x if we wanted to, that's not a great name, but we could call it x and then we can assign it a value and see what result happens when we use that value x. In many programming languages, variables and this other thing called constants, which is sort of also a named place in memory, but it's one that it can't be changed, they have to be declared and they have to be assigned a data type. That's very common in all the C-like languages, so C# and C++ and Java and all those things. But Python, although data types very much exist in Python, they're automatically assigned their data type based on what type of value they're assigned. So there are no variable declarations. We'll have more details on variables, what they are, how to use them in the next video series, not coming up immediately. But this is just the basics to get us started. Anyway, let's go back to our example. So here's our example code so far. As I said, we're continuing the same example from the last video, and it would be great for you to go through and try building this yourself once you have Python up and running in Visual Studio or Atom or whatever. Go ahead, put your own name in and do some things here. We're not doing the output yet, we're just going to be working with variables. And so I said here on line 9 in the last video you saw that we were going to assign the name of the company. And so we're going to make a new variable and we're going to call it company name. And we're going to set it equal to just something arbitrary, Bitum, widgets, and flanges. There's a few things that happen on this line already, and one thing you're going to notice about it is that the company name, the name of the variable is company name, it shows up in white. And then the contents of that variable show up in kind of a reddish color. Now that might vary depending on what developer environment you're in. It might be a little different if you have default settings on Atom, for example. But here we have it as red. What that's doing is because the value of that variable is in quotes, it's taken as a string, a piece of text data. And so it's just telling us, like, this is text, we're going to color it red so that the programmer immediately knows we're talking about text there. Another thing you'll notice about that line is that I've called it company name, and I've written it in all lowercase with an underscore. There is a style guide for Python code, and we'll talk about that in a few more videos later. But all I need to say about that right now is I'm giving it a descriptive name, and I'm using an underscore to separate the words, basically just to make it clearer to the people watching, which includes you. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to assign the number of employees. I'll just pick some arbitrary number here. Next, I'm going to assign the fiscal year. You'll see the types of things this is doing in the comment header. Fiscal year equals 2020. Assign the projected gross sales. Projected gross sales equals, I'll go with $280,000. So these are the 4 variables I'm going to need to do this program. You can see from my description above that I'm going to use the company's name, number of employees, fiscal year, and projected gross sales. That's all of my variables. I don't need a declaration. I don't need to specify the type. But you are going to find that these end up being assigned a type. And if I hover over them in Visual Studio Code, and this will be different on other environments, but it's actually going to try and tell me the type of each of these variables. Let me tell you about each. We've already talked about company name. It's storing the name of the company, and it's storing it as a string, which means text data. Number of employees, well, that represents the number of employees. And I've set it equal to 203. It's not in quotes because it's not being treated as text. It's being stored as a number. I can even do numeric operations on it, and that's why this says int. Int in this case is short for integer. So I'm assigning an integer value of 203 to this variable called number of employees. And if ever at some point in the program logic I wanted to say number of employees plus 1, well, that would be 204, and I can do things like that, but we're doing a very simple piece of code here. Then we're going to assign the fiscal year. I call it fiscal year, and I set it equal to 2020. But when I hover over the name fiscal year, you're going to see it shows str for string. That means I'm storing this as text data. The reason for this is that I've surrounded it with quotes. And again, I've got that coloration that's going to show me there that this is being represented as stored as a string, as text data. There are reasons that you might store it as text, and there's reasons you might store it as an integer. In this case, I went with text because I don't expect to do any mathematical operations on this number. And so if there was a possibility that I was going to accidentally do math on this variable, that might be a bad thing. So sometimes we think carefully about this. If you think about, for example, maybe not with a year, but with a phone number, there's no reason you're ever going to do a mathematical operation on a phone number. So it makes sense usually to store that type of thing as string data. You'll learn more about that in this class, but also probably in your database class. Finally, I'm assigning the projected gross sales. That typo lasted a while. And that's $280,000. And you'll see it says float on both the number and the name. Float is referring to a floating point variable, and we'll talk more about exactly what that means, but that's basically a data type designed to hold decimal values. And so I've created this variable, I've called it projected gross sales, I've assigned it this value of $280,000, and now I have that. I haven't done anything with it yet. There's not really any processing in this, and we haven't completed the output yet. But there I have named and assigned values for 4 variables, and I'm aware of their data types, and that can be useful. Again, this is a real introduction to variables. We haven't really got into how we work with these yet, but this is just an introduction to how variables work, and that's all I really wanted you to see right now. So in this video, we talked about using variables and assigning values to them in Python, and in the next video, we'll talk about producing output with Python. I keep saying with Python and in Python because this type of thing, although I say a lot of concepts are general to programming languages, and declaring variables is something that's general like that, it does look different in different programming languages. If you want to check in on your knowledge right now, see if you can explain, even just briefly or vaguely, what a variable is. And if you can't do that right now, that's okay, because we're still going to talk about it more later. Thanks for watching.